Hi guys, and welcome to this edition of Book Review, this time with rocket legend Alan Bond. And we're going to be having a look at some of these amazing books that I have laid out on this table and seeing what Alan thinks about them. So, Alan, in front of us we have an assortment of various different books. Do you recognise any of them? And out of the ones that you do, would you recommend any of them?
Well, yes, I recognise most of the Haynes manuals, the Owner's Workshop series,
Yes.
which I think are extremely good publications. They're very informative. They've, in all cases, chosen first-class people to do the technical contribution, and they are incredibly well illustrated. So the ones that you've got here on Apollo 11, Saturn V, and although I had not encountered that one until you showed it me a short while ago, just a quick look through it, this is David Baker that has produced that. That's an extremely interesting book, which you can trace the history of rocket development through.
I would concur, yes.
Of course, von Braun's Mars project is an absolute classic, and even today, when you go through this and see the detail that went into this piece of work, it's just amazing. And of course, there was this was sending a whole fleet of vehicles, and a bit later on, von Braun with Willy Ley sort of scaled back the scope of that project, and there's a second version of that. And I would recommend anybody to read those. If you're interested in going to Mars, that's where you start, and that is very, very good.
Yes, it is great. Like, out of these, I would say that's probably my favourite.
I think so, and I've read this many times, and the follow-on one as well, which he spends a little bit more time in the follow-on talking about Mars itself as a planet, and reviewing what was known in the 1950s. It's laughable today in terms of the maps of Mars, Schiaparelli's maps of Mars and so on, but nonetheless, as a piece of scoping work, it's got to stand up very, very well. In the same way that von Braun's other studies of space stations and orbital rockets stood up. We had the space shuttle, and we've got the International Space Station. Sure, in detail, they don't look like the von Braun proposal, but even so, the overall picture is very, very good, and the Mars project is as well. I'm interested to see that you have a couple of provocative ones. The USS Enterprise and Dander, Pilot of the Future. Of course, Dander is true and the Enterprise is just straightforward fiction, but this is a really good piece of work by Rod Barzilay, and Rod for a long time produced a new version of the Eagle comic, which still goes and is very, very good. But the analysis that's gone into trying to turn Frank Hampson's views into something that might be engineering is really extremely good in this. I spent many years trying to find out whether the spaceships that were in Dander could be made to work, and sadly, without some major breakthroughs in physics, the answer is no. But the same is true of Star Trek, of course, and the Enterprise. What astounded me is that when Star Trek first appeared on our screens, and I won't tell you what we used to call it in those days, but it wasn't Star Trek. This all seemed absolute fiction. And we've got here an image of the matter transporter in operation. What astounds me is the bit of science of this, which might actually come true, is the actual matter transporter, whereas the propulsion, getting to high factors of the speed of light, I see very little chance of that actually working. But since the discovery of quantum entanglement, the possibility of matter transporter actually working one day might actually work.
Interesting.
So,
Interestingly, one of the very early design concepts of the Enterprise shows a completely uncanny resemblance to an Alcubierre drive.
right.
Yeah.
I can't comment on that. What I do know is that when they made the first model, they accidentally hung it upside down and found that it looked better than the way it was supposed to be hung. But I think that the Star Trek series obviously has been extremely inspirational for a lot of people. And I think that amongst even professional astrophysicists, there's a strong desire to try to find some way of exceeding the speed of light. But sadly, up to this point in time, over those sort of distances, there's no practical way known. We talk about wormholes and so on as though you can find one in every workshop, but the reality is that there is no known way to actually make that work. But nonetheless, I mean, it's good, entertaining stuff.
Yes.
So what else have we got? Now, one thing that I noticed over on your pile over there is Rendezvous with Rama.
This is... I know so many works of fiction, it's difficult to tell which one's my favourite, but this is definitely on the top 5 list.
So, as with very much that Arthur Clarke produced, this is extremely well conceived. He'd obviously thought a lot about different people's concepts of what might one day constitute what have become known as world ships. And I think you've got to go back to J.D. Bernal in the late 1920s to find the first world ship concepts. But Rama was a really good idea. I'm not so keen on the follow-on versions of Rama.
I haven't read the follow-on ones, but I don't actually plan to, but because from what I'm told, they kind of ruined the thing. But
yeah, I feel that this ended correctly.
Yeah.
Where you're just left with the idea that the Ramans do everything in threes, and that's the very last line of the book. And I feel that was a good place to end this. But one of the interesting things is that one of my colleagues, when Oumuamua showed up in the solar system, immediately had a look at Rendezvous with Rama, and the similarities of the discovery of Oumuamua and the first observations of Rama are quite interesting. So
interestingly, Oumuamua, it didn't fly within Earth's sphere of influence, but from what I remember, it flew close, like under half an AU maybe. I'm not exactly sure.
I can't remember the distance, but unfortunately it was well past perihelion on its way out of the solar system when it was detected. But to me, Oumuamua still represents some puzzles. I'm not saying it's an interstellar probe by any means, but right now Oumuamua has displayed non-Newtonian forces acting on it, which are difficult to explain. The idea that these are produced by outgassing from the body would be inconsistent unless the outgassing is with jets of extremely high velocity. And I personally still find that there are issues of Oumuamua that, quite frankly, hand on heart, we have not yet explained. There have been claims in the scientific literature that all this is straightforward and in line with other bodies. I think that's too sweeping a statement. And to me personally, I feel that Oumuamua still has some explaining to do. Unfortunately, it's quite unlikely that we'll ever see Oumuamua again. It's on an extremely fast exit trajectory. By the time we've got that capability, it will probably be too far away to do anything about. But interesting. But Rendezvous with Rama, pretty much a masterpiece, I think. And I particularly like the propulsion, because that's what I like, of where it dives into the solar corona and is obviously using solar atmosphere as reaction mass in order to do its mid-course correction and push it on whichever direction it was actually heading to.
That's one interpretation, I suppose. It did appear to be making course corrections before it entered the corona. It did a flip maneuver to re-angle itself. In the book, they concluded that it was a non-Newtonian physics drive. It may just be that it was using the sun's corona's reaction mass. We'd have to see whether it did have those internal gyroscopes that were proposed.
Yeah, I think we could speculate on that, but I don't know what was in Arthur's mind when he wrote it.
Yeah.
Let's face it, it is a work of fiction. The Expanse, I liked the comment in there about someone asked the authors, how did the Epstein drive work? And the answer was extremely well. So I think we have to say the same about Arthur's drive for the Raman cylinder. So what else have you got here to...
Well, I've got a few classics. Well, these aren't actually classics.
So The Martian is really very good.
Good enough to be a classic.
I think it's very thought-provoking, which science fiction should be. I think, in my own mind, good science fiction is something that gives you something to go away and think about. Obviously, there's the relaxing stuff where we spend a lot of time sort of playing kick-arse with aliens and things like that. But that's... You don't usually go away having any deep thoughts about that.
Right.
But The Martian is a piece of science fiction that it does make you go away and sort of think, is that how it would really be? What's the environment actually like? Could you really do the things that he's done? I think
not exactly, but I think it's pretty close.
I think it's only let down by the rather gratuitous sort of cliffhanger ending. Where he has to strip the spaceship down in order to do the final bit of jiggery-pokery in orbit to finally meet up with the rescue vessel. I find that slightly gratuitous, and I don't think it would have lost anything by having a fairly straightforward exit.
If I remember correctly, he had to remove 5.7 tons of mass from a 12.3 ton ascent vehicle, I think, which is, he's reducing the weight by half. So, I mean, it's not impossible.
No, I could go along with that. I just felt that from the storyline point of view,
right? Yeah.
The final sort of hold your breath sort of ending was a bit gratuitous, but the rest of the story I enjoyed immensely.
I agree. It was a great read. To be honest, the thing that the only thing I actually found in here, which I find, which actually like annoys me almost. I don't mind the dust storm, that can be explained away by a few other things. The thing that I find really weird is the fact that there was only one radio that he had. None of the pre-supply probes or the rovers or anything had radios on them, but like, there's probably a way to explain that away as well. Overall, I think this is a great book.
It was well thought out, and as I say, it makes you go away and think. Once you've thought about it, you might find all kinds of things that you could quibble with, but it's a great piece of fiction. It certainly makes you think what's coming next. It's a superb read.
Yeah. Now,
so what else do you want to?
There are a few more books that I have here. For instance, Artemis, also by Andy Weir. Are you familiar with the story of this?
No, I'm not.
Basically, there is a city on the moon with a population of 2,000, and the main character is this woman who is like, it's kind like she smuggles in items from supply runs from Earth, and the one that we get her introduced to is smuggling in a bunch of cigarettes to some really rich person who lives there, because of course cigarettes are extremely dangerous on a lunar base. And she gets caught up in this giant plan in order to, I forget the exact specifics, but she has to go over to some like trawlers that are going through the dust and digging up dirt and like weld some stuff onto them in order to disable them. She almost gets caught, and she gets wrapped up in this giant plot to do with an a steelworks factory with a nuclear... It's been a while since I've read it. It's very good, though. I remember that. It's very, very good. I would highly recommend
it. I shall put it on my reading list. It's...
Now, the book directly beneath it is one by William Shatner. You can actually get audiobooks of William Shatner reading this.
Can you really?
Yes. I know that
I'm
you
a
like
great fan of
audiobooks.
audiobooks, so again, I'll make sure that that's on my reading list.
Yeah. Now, just going through the other books quickly, there's Earthbound Astronaut, there's Buzz Aldrin's Mission to Mars, which is very good. There's the physics of Star Trek, which goes into some of the stuff you were talking about with matter
Yes.
transporters.
Yes.
I would disagree with you. I don't think the matter transporters literally teleport objects. I think they just move them at light speed or beyond light speed through space.
It's very vague within Star Trek what actually happens, but
Yeah.
in terms of being able to copy something accurately, once upon a time it was felt that within the limitations of quantum mechanics you couldn't copy an object accurately, but it's now realised that in principle it's possible through entanglement to make a precise copy and transport that somewhere else. And so
Question is, could you transport it instantly?
actually getting to the point where you could transport a macroscopic object rather than a subatomic particle or an atomic particle, I think is probably pushing where we're at rather hard. It may never be possible, but at least it's one bit of Star Trek physics which today you could sort of point to and say at least there's a possibility.
Okay.
Whereas with regard to the way that the Enterprise is supposed to create a sort of space distortion and then ride on it, there's no way at all that we know how to do any of that.
Well, we do in theory, but in practice you need negative mass, which
I don't think we even know how to do that part in theory, so at least there's a theoretical aspect to wormholes, provided you've got a source of negative energy, negative mass. But in order to actually transport an object through physical space at above the speed of light, we know of no way at all that even starts to come onto the cards.
I mean, it would be pretty simple to contract space in front of you and expand it behind you. The difficult part would not be messing up anything that's in your path by stretching and squeezing it.
What you have to remember with any of these issues with regard to space-time is we've got a set of equations with coefficients in front of different terms, and as you vary those you finish up with a different shape space, and so in principle you can muck about with those to your heart's content and you can make whatever shape space you want. However, when it comes to then interpreting the physics of that and saying could I actually make those coefficients do that, then as far as I can see the answer is no. A very simple example that I like to quote because we once made this mistake. When you're working out the drag on a vehicle, if you just change the drag coefficient by putting a minus sign in front of it, all of a sudden the drag becomes thrust, and you get amazing performance out of the vehicle when the drag turns into thrust.
Right.
But all it is an equation in which you've changed a coefficient for which there is no physical reality.
Right.
And when you look at what the actual physical sources of drag are, you realise that just could never happen.
Right.
Now, likewise, in the equations of general relativity, when you have a look at what you've got to do at these various constants physically to make them what you want, then it can't happen. There are some solutions. So, for example, hang on a minute, his name's gone out of my mind. Gödel, Kurt Gödel, found solutions in which if the universe has net angular momentum, there would exist within the universe closed time-like lines in which you could accelerate a vehicle onto and fly back in time.
I've heard of those closed timeline loops or something.
Closed time-like loops. So near any rapidly rotating massive body, in principle, such curves can exist. Whether you can get into them or not is another question, and that's a philosophical debate at this point in time, until we know more about the science. But Gödel showed that if the universe had got net angular momentum, and from all the observations we've made so far, that appears not to be the case, but if it did have, then you can find solutions which do have closed time-like loops within the physical universe.
Okay.
And since we're talking about science fiction, a favourite bit of science fiction of mine back in the 1950s, Journey into Space on radio, which was a very popular radio series, sort of 53. The time travellers were in fact using closed time-like loops in the universe in order to do time travel and to get around the universe, essentially within the lifetime of a creature in it.
Journey into Space.
Journey into Space, which you can get it. It's an audio book series.
I'll have to look into that. Sounds very interesting.
It's a very interesting series. There were 3 different ones. The original one, which was Operation Luna, and then The Red Planet, and then World in Peril. Those were the 3 series that they did. There were some other little bits, but they were the 3 main series by Charles Chilton. And very, very exciting. In fact, that, just as a matter of interest, that was the last radio programme that had more viewers, more listeners than television attracted viewers at the time.
Interesting.
So it was a massive success.
So, the next thing that I should probably talk about, and also, actually, well, other than this, the last thing on the table, is this book, Ad Astra, An Illustrated Guide to Reading the Planet. I've only read it through once, and that was a while ago, but it is very good, and it's written by my friend Dallas Campbell.
Right.
I would recommend reading this, and it basically just goes over like the history of spaceflight very briefly, and it explains all of the stuff that went into that.
Right. That looks very interesting. Like many of these productions these days, it's beautifully produced.
Yeah.
And well illustrated.
Yeah, it has a lot of very interesting images that you can't really see that. You don't really see that.
I like this one, hanging the spacesuit out on the clothesline.
Yeah.
Very good.
So, by the way, Dallas Campbell actually has a collection of spacesuits.
Really?
He has a real Russian spacesuit, Sokol, I believe it is, a launch and entry suit, and he has one of, if not the best, replica A7L suit in the world. He might actually do a book on spacesuits in the future. I'd like to see that.
Excellent, yeah.
But yes, and then the last book on this table, I believe, I'll talk about Seize the Moment in a second, is One Small Step by Jerry Stone. This is a great book about the moon landings. It's aimed more primarily at young children, but it's still interesting if you know a lot about space. And I'm going to be honest, I really like this because of the pop-outs, but it is still interesting, like the way the images are laid out and whatnot. I would recommend looking at this, and it has a full fold-out thing of the newspaper article at the time of the moon landing.
Yes.
So yeah, that's that
Very
one.
good. Yeah.
Very good. Also, that's a physical thing, and it has a 3D image on the front.
Very nice.
And then I think this is actually the last one on the table that we haven't gone over, which is Seize the Moment by Helen Sharman.
Right.
Helen Sharman, the first ever British astronaut. This is great, and it's an autobiography of Helen Sharman's life and what she went through in order to get onto the Mir space station.
Yeah, she was greatly underrated, unfortunately, at the time. And getting some recognition now, I'm pleased to see.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, she went at a time when British governments were very anti-space and very anti-manned space. So she chose exactly the wrong time to do that. But I'm glad that she's getting the recognition these days.
Right. And then the last book that I want to look at is Where Once We Stood by Christopher Riley and Martin Impey.
Right.
And this I actually want to give to you as a gift. It is An incredible book. It has some glorious pieces of artwork, and it explains step by step what happened, what each of the astronauts did while exploring the lunar surface on all of the missions, and it does it in incredible detail, and it does it in such a way that even if you knew nothing about space, it would still be understandable, but even if you know a lot about space, it's still really interesting.
That is beautiful. Thank you very much, Clarence.
It's a pleasure.
It's very, very good. Very much appreciated. Chris Riley is always good.
Yeah.
I don't know Martin Impey's work very well, but
yeah,
I know Chris Riley, and yeah, this is going to go into my treasured collection. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. So yeah, that concludes this book review with Alan Bond. We'll probably have another book review at some point with another guest star, but thank you for taking your time to do this.
Thank you very much, Clarence. Very enjoyable.